This lecture is on the segments and chambers of the eye. So you have two segments to the eye, and one is the posterior segment, and that is behind the lens. Then you also have the anterior segment, which is in front of the lens. But the anterior segment itself is divided into two pieces for our convenience in terms of thinking about them. So the anterior segment is then made up of, and this can be confusing, but bear with me here, pay attention here, the posterior chamber of the anterior segment, and that then is behind the iris. And then also, let's do this, then there is also the anterior chamber of the posterior segment, and that then is what is in front of the iris. So let's draw this again. You know how this is going to look now. Here we have the eye, the cornea bulging out a bit at the front. So there we are. And here we have the fibrous tunic. You know about that. And now let's take a look at what I've been talking about. So again, we've got the optic nerve coming out here, roughly speaking. All right, let's take a look at that vascular tunic. We're still, for the time being, talking about the vascular tunic. So here we have the vascular tunic with the ciliary bodies coming in like this. Here we are. So remember, we have some ciliary processes in here on the ciliary body. We should actually make that a little bit shorter. I'm overdrawing it so you can see where it is. And then, of course, we have the iris projecting in here. So there we go. And we have the lens here. So here you have the lens. Here, of course, you have the ciliary body. And here, and that goes for the top as well, for this as well. And then, of course, you have the iris there. All right, so how's this look then? All of this back here, then, this is all the posterior segment. Here it is. There's a lot of posterior segment here. Then we have the anterior segment in front. That's what we're going to do here, since I made this with some little lines going that way. Let's just say here, all of this then, all of that whole area, then all of this is the anterior segment. Feeling okay about that? So we have the posterior segment and we have the anterior segment. But then I started talking about the posterior chamber and the anterior chamber. So let's take a look at those then. So the posterior chamber of the anterior segment is behind the iris. Here's the iris. So I'm going to draw this in green just so you can see the area that we are talking about. So here we have behind the iris then. So this now is the, let's see if I can do this. Here we have the posterior chamber then of the anterior segment. And then let's draw the other one in purple. So then all through here, all of this now. This now is the anterior chamber of the anterior segment. So there we have the map, basically, of where these things are. Okay, so that's where these things are. What's in them? So what's in these things is fluids. So now in the posterior segment, then the fluid that you find there is the vitreous humor. So the posterior segment then is filled with the vitreous humor. Let's write this in now. Filled with vitreous humor. Humor is another word for fluid. So here we have the vitreous humor. So this then is a clear gel. Now when I say gel, I mean that it is thick. It flows, but not easily. It has a fair amount of substance to it. It's squishy, basically. So it's a clear gel. So it allows light to get through it which is a good thing. And it helps to hold the lens in place by supporting it from the back. What did I just say? It's pretty straightforward. Here you have all of this clear gel. As I said, it's got some substance to it. And so if it is filling this back chamber, then if it's pretty plump, it's just going to be pushing gently on the lens and holding it in place. Now, another thing that it does, carrying on with the vitreous humor then, is it also then helps hold the retina in place. So the retina is the sensory tunic. I have not discussed it in detail yet, but you're going to have the retina. That's kind of all back here. As I said, I will be discussing the retina in another lecture, but you have the retina roughly in here. And the retina is very tissuey, it's very thin, it's kind of like a wet Kleenex in many ways. So, you know, it's not real strong, and having this kind of thick goo pushing back on it can actually help hold the retina in place as well. So it helps hold the retina in place then. By pushing against it. And by maintaining the shape and the pressure inside the eyeball. Thereby and I will do it like this. So thereby counteracting the changes in shape and the internal pressure. Actually, I'm going to take out that comma. Counteracting the changes in shape and internal pressure. I think that makes it a bit clearer what's going on. That would otherwise be produced by the muscles that pull the eyes, and I'm going to say here, on the outside, and these are known as your extrinsic eye muscles. So what did I just say? It goes like this. You have this jelly in here, basically, and on the outside of your eye, you have muscles that are pulling on the eye. That is how the eyeball turns around in your head. It's what allows you to do this, to raise and lower your eyes and look backwards and forwards and this kind of thing without even moving your head. And of course, the interior of your skull in the eye socket is not perfectly spherical. And you have these muscles pulling on the outside of the eye. So there's going to be a certain amount of of minor deformings, temporary deformings of this big globular eyeball, even though the sclera is pretty tough. So you're going to have these little bits of changes of shape, of changes of internal pressure, and having this clear gel just kind of sitting there pushing against the retina helps to hold it in place. I hope this makes sense. So that then is the posterior segment of the eyeball. So now let's talk about the anterior segment of the eyeball. And remember, this is the part that is in front of the lens. And this is filled with what is called aqueous humor. Aqueous means watery, and that tells you then that this is a more watery substance. So here in the anterior segment, all this stuff in front of the lens then. So this then is filled with aqueous humor. There we go. So the aqueous humor then is a clear fluid. Again, we want clear fluids inside the eye so that light can pass through unhindered. It is very similar in composition to blood plasma. There's a reason for that. So the aqueous humor then is formed and drained continuously, and it circulates throughout the segment. So all this area then in front of the lens then, we have this fluid that is clear and blood-like, although without any blood cells. and it is busy circulating throughout that entire area. So you have a circulating fluid. Sounds like blood, doesn't it? But without the blood cells. Now, just as an aside, just so you know, let's put this over here. By contrast, while your aqueous humor is continually being made new and drained out and replaced with newer stuff and drained out and replaced with newer stuff, by contrast, then, the vitreous humor is formed in the embryo, and it lasts a lifetime. So once you've got it, that's the vitreous humor you're going to have. By contrast, the aqueous humor then is formed by filtering blood. And what that filtration process does is it removes the blood cells. So it filters, so you have the blood filtered, you have the blood cells removed from the blood in the capillaries of the ciliary processes. And you remember the ciliary processes are the ciliary processes of the ciliary body. What all this is saying is that you have the ciliary body there. It has these folds and wrinkles in that tiny amount of tissue. Those folds and wrinkles in that tissue are the ciliary processes of the ciliary body. And the aqueous humor then, remember, it is constantly made fresh and therefore needs to be drained away. So it drains out through the, and let's put this over here. It drains out through the scleral venous sinus, known sometimes in older manuals as the Canal of Schlemm. And this drain basically encircles. This is kind of an interesting shape to think about, but this drain then encircles the eye at the junction of the sclera and the cornea. So you know where the sclera is, that's here. You know where the cornea is, that's here. So at roughly this level here and here is where you are going to find the scleral venous scleral venous sinus, and it encircles the eye, and this is what allows the aqueous humor that is constantly being made to drain out of the anterior segment. So why do we have this fluid constantly being made and drained? What is going on with all of that making and draining? What's going on is that the aqueous humor supplies oxygen and nutrients. That is to say, it basically performs the functions of blood to the lens and cornea, and like blood, it drains the wastes. So you have this sort of blood-like fluid, minus the blood cells, supplying oxygen and nutrients to all of the structures in here, and also draining the wastes away. So doing, as I said, basically the job that blood does. And that works only in a small space like the front of the eye, because normally you need blood cells, because the red blood cells carry a lot more oxygen than you can have simply dissolved in blood plasma. So over a short distance, you can keep, having this oxygen, roughly oxygen-rich aqueous humor draining in or being pushed in, circulating, giving oxygen to all of the cells in there, and then draining out again. And in that small space, you can do without the blood cells. And we need to do without the blood cells in that area there, because remember, if we had blood cells circulating in that area, they would get in the way of the light coming in through the cornea and passing through this area before going through the lens and into the vitreous humor. So you do not want things like blood cells blocking the light there. So we have this clear fluid that is otherwise performing the job that blood does in that tiny space. Now, we have this stuff constantly being made and constantly being drained. You can see a problem here if the drainage is blocked. If somehow or another you keep having aqueous humor made, but on the other hand, the aqueous humor does not drain away at the same rate, then you've got a problem. So if drainage is blocked, then you get a buildup of aqueous humor in the eye. And this, of course, increases pressure. Within the eye. You may have heard of this problem. This is the problem that is called glaucoma. So glaucoma is a serious eye disease. So with glaucoma, then, if the pressure within the eye becomes too great, it can compress the retina. The retina, as you recall, is the sensory tunic. The sensory tunic is that which responds to light. It's what allows you to see. So compressing the retina can create problems. So it can compress the retina and it can compress the optic nerve. The optic nerve is what takes that information about light from the retina and transmits it to your brain. So this then can lead to blindness unless it is detected and treated early. And that is the end of this lecture.